This is Season 1, Episode 3 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your tabletop role-playing game. Our episode this week is Using Notice and Perception in Games. Are we doing it wrong? Or the one skill to rule them all? Or searching the dead bodies is easy. Welcome to Mastering the RPG. Again, it's a tabletop RPG podcast. We're really about maximizing your game, whether you're a player or a game master. We've got advice, ideas, cool stuff found, and some strong opinions, and we hope everybody gets something out of it. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and James, and you can find information about us at masteringtherpg.com. That's all one word. And if you've got questions, comments, you want us to arbitrate arguments with your friends, whatever, you can send a note to Game Master at masteringtherpg.com. Again, both of them are all one word. So, hey, gents, let's get right into it this week. And I think, James, you're going to be leading us off. What kind of things have you been up to?
G'day. Hi, everyone. I've been, as per usual, running games, or rather writing games. No actual games this week. It's vacation time here in Australia, so this is one of those great times where you get to sit down and prepare for the next 10 weeks of role-playing games that I do. So I've kind of halfway through my 70-session preparation for the next few months, which is kind of a bit fun. So I am neck deep in writing some 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons scenarios for Feywild games. I'm doing some Storm King's Thunder stuff, and starting a brand new campaign for the very iconic Curse of Strahd for the 4th time. So dusting off my terrible Transylvanian accent. So yeah, deep in research, deep in fun.
Can we get a sample?
No, you may not. Oh, terrible. No, we did accents last week. We're not doing it again this week. So no, it's one of those great times where you don't have games to run, but you get to let the imagination run wild and do all that great writing stuff. So it's good fun. Yeah.
I know Eric's been letting his imagination run wild. So what have you been up to?
A little too wild, some would say. I just did part 1 of our crossover between RPG at Home and Tabletop Tango for our one-shot Savage Worlds Agents of Woe. That was fun. That was illuminating. We'll talk about it a lot in the next episode, I think. Also doing a little bit of writing on the side, looking to do a setting or something. So just been tinkering with that right now as far as games go.
Cool. Personally, I'm still trying to, we got a kind of a big moment in my campaign I'm running that, Eric, you're in, and that's coming up, and hopefully that'll go well. And at the time of this recording, I'm still working on my Dragonlance adventure for Gen Con, which did a play test, went reasonably good.
Yeah, that was very fun.
Yeah, I think
very fun.
And I appreciate all the input, and I think I need some tweaks there. Need to throw in a dramatic task, I think, to make it that much more interesting. So, and this is Savage Worlds. So, yeah, we've all been pretty busy. But, I think it's time to look at our regular segment where we look at something super cool, a cool thing found. And I'm going to turn
cool
that
stuff?
Cool stuff.
Cool stuff. Cool stuff. We have to do that now. Cool stuff. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to take this one. My cool stuff this week, and to be fair, it's been a couple of weeks since this little beauty arrived on my doorstep, but I've been desperate to talk to people about it because I think it's just amazing. It's the 2nd edition of not 2nd edition, but the 2nd book in a series by a fantastic writer named Keith Ammann. This is a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons book per se, but I've got to say you could use it for just about any fantasy-like role-playing game. Keith Ammann writes a series based on his blog called The Monsters Know What They're Doing, and this edition is called More, The Monsters Know What They're Doing. It's the 2nd one in the series. For those who play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, it's dealing with the monsters of Mordenkainen's and Volo's Guide to Monsters. And introduces another 190 monsters for his wonderful series. Now, for those that don't know about The Monsters Know What They're Doing, this is something that I think has been a game changer for how I run games, and I'm not alone. I noticed on the blurb of this book, R.A. Salvatore, who wrote The Crystal Shard and Drizzt Do'Urden and is one of the kind of founding writers of old school Dungeons and Dragons, says this book almost instantly made me a better dungeon master, and I've got to say I wholeheartedly agree. What Keith does in these books is provide tactical information and wonderful kind of breakdown on how to make monsters effective and how to make them useful and how to make sense of what can often be really complicated stat blocks, where you're not quite sure how to use a monster or how to use an ability or what ability you should use over another, or in particular, if you've got lots of spells, what spell would that monster use in any one time? And these books are amazing. He's done 2 of them. The first one came out about 5 years ago. He's just released this latest version. They're about 600 pages each, so they're massive. And they break down every single monster in the official Dungeons & Dragons and give you some tactical information, a little bit of theory crafting, just to guide dungeon masters on how to use these monsters better.
Oh.
And they are really, really extraordinary. I'm going to do the old school grey-haired guy and say, look, back in my day, in the old school monster manuals and the monsters compendiums and things, there used to be a lot more detail about monsters than is currently in the current monster manuals and the current stat blocks, where they might have talked about habitat or tactics or organization of a society. A lot of that's started to come out of the official books of 5th edition. And I think what Keith does is bring a lot of that stuff back in so that you can use the information a lot better. I've got to say, the first time I read the first book, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, I just looked at the goblins and changed entirely the way I used goblins, to the point where I TPK'd the next party that came up against goblins because my tactics was way too effective in Lost Mines and Found Delver. And they're just wonderful. I've got a little example here, and I thought I'd just read it, so, just to give you guys an idea about the way Keith approaches this. In this instance, he's talking about shadows. Our shadows, of course, are strange, mysterious, ethereal creatures. They've got a number of abilities, and Keith would say things like this. First, it lies in wait for a victim. When one appears, it will use its bonus action and its movement to hide, then approach with stealth to within reach of the target. If it's not spotted, it will attack the same round, rolling with advantage using its strength drain action. But if the party notices it, it keeps moving to try again the next round. The beauty of this tactic is, even if the PC spots the shadow, the DM can say, well, you just saw a shadow move past you. Not indicating that it's a creature, but it's just a shadow. It's that kind of stuff that he will use for every single monster in every single page. And I've got to say, it's absolutely invaluable. Really, really good book. And I thoroughly recommend it. The new book, More Monsters Know What They're Doing, he's adding how to combine monsters. So how would you have goblins and wolves fighting together? He deals a lot about summoning and conjuring. So if you've got a player that conjures a beast or a demon or that kind of stuff, 584 pages of really wonderful tactics. He's also started to list some of his house rules. And he's got a great section on how to use counterspell and bits and pieces, but really, really good. If you're opening up one of those monster manuals, looking at a stat block, going, I have no idea how to use this effectively, these are great books to use. He has a website called themonstersknow.com, because these books came from his blog, but you can also order them from pretty much anywhere. We get them here in Australia, so I'm sure that our US viewers will use them, but thoroughly recommend it. Keith Ullman, Monsters Know What They're Doing, and More Monsters Know What They're Doing.
Now, is there any mention of like pitfalls for monsters? Because one of the things, besides not knowing to do with the monster, I think on the other side, oftentimes newer GMs might pick a monster that's like, that combines with another one and it's really hard on the party, or too hard, or if you have a magic heavy party, this monster might be more effective. Does he mention any of those, or is it just kind of how to use it the most effectively too?
A little bit,
Okay.
not as much. He will, in each of the sections, if there is a specific weakness, he will say, if this happens, then do something different. So, for example, in the piece on zombies, he says zombies will attack relentlessly, unless they get hit by radiant damage, or they get or someone holds out a holy symbol, and then they'll change their tactics. So he uses what might occur if a weakness is exploited. He'll also talk about what is a threshold, where based on their intelligence, if they take this many wounds, or if two of their group are incapacitated, what might they do tactically as a group? So yeah, he uses a little bit of that stuff as well.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, it sounds like this would be really good for a new DM, or is it still kind of somebody who's experienced where they're really just trying to do better? Would it be good for a new Dungeon Master?
Yeah, absolutely both. I find every time I'm using a new monster now, I'll have a look to see what his advice is, particularly with spells. So if you've got a Duergar, for example, a Dark Dwarf, might have 4 or 5 different spells. Keith's advice will be round 1, try this, round 2, try this, round 3, if this doesn't work, try this. So kind of he's done the theory crafting behind it a little bit to kind of get the tactics of how you might combine different spells and abilities together to be the most effective. So, and that's the kind of thing that even experienced Dungeon Masters, you'll look at a stat block and go, I think I will know what to do here. I think I get an idea about what it is. He's actually done a bit more research and a bit more thinking about it to save you the trouble of needing to.
And you did mention that while it's 5e, obviously specifics, it could be useful for other types of systems, just because he gets into the like psychology and maybe the culture and how this monster, like not just its abilities, but the way that you run it makes it feel different. So even if I was playing Savage Worlds or Pathfinder, looking at zombies, be like, oh, that's a really good idea. I could incorporate that into my game.
Very much so. So for a lot of the generic SRD stuff where, many different systems might be using these, you can still look up the same. So there's great, and I just quickly peruse the undead section just to get me a sense of it. Looking at skeletons, well, were they an archer or were they melee? Do they have armor? Do they have not armor? How will they interact? Well, that can be generic. You don't necessarily need the 5th edition rules to do that. And for a lot of these things where you might have a were-rat or a werewolf or vampires or any of that stuff, a lot of the tropes are very similar. So yes, they might not have the exact wording, but the tactics or who they might approach or incapacitate first, or how they might engage in a fight, will be very similar. Very, very similar. So I would recommend it to everyone. He's also done another book, which I haven't touched on yet, which is called Live to Tell the Tale, which is combat tactics for PCs. So it's the player version of this book. A couple of my players in my Rime of the Frostmaiden game have bought it and love it as well. And I've got to say, it changes the manner in which they fight effectively as a team. So if you've got a more kind of strategic-minded group, he does have a player's guide as well, which certainly ups the strategic element of your play style too.
It's just amazing. It's almost like academic research. It's like research the topic, and here's a treatise of all the things that they've learned. That's pretty cool.
I think you made a good. I do think it's unfortunate that all the most of the monster manuals from all the different systems that I played or looked at, all the different monster stat blocks, whatever, they do fail to kind of mention, maybe here's like a sentence on what's a good way to utilize this monster, or again, like here's maybe something to look out for if your party has this. So I think that is something that is kind of missing, and that would be really helpful. I don't know why games haven't kept that up or readopted it, because it seems like something for. Yeah, I guess. But sentence.
People want more monsters, not better fleshed out monsters.
More lore? I don't know. You can maybe like shorten the lore a little bit and give us some actual practical advice on running them. Because for something like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, right? Those monsters are very complex, and there's a lot of pitfalls going both ways for new GMs and even more experienced GMs. So I think that would have been very useful for them to have something like this, or just to do it in the stat block itself. So that's really cool. Really
absolutely. It's $1,000 worth, $1,000, 1,000 pages of info. Like
$1,000. Oh my god.
$1,000. No. And a great example is like the Lich, which is kind of an iconic kind of undead spell casting with a spell list and ability list as long as your arm. He's done 16 pages on it.
Oh my god!
This is how you play a Lich, and I used it against my Curse of Strahd game last year, and it was terrifying for the group. So if you are really wanting to challenge your players, do this. I will say Eric played in a game with me last year where I ambushed the group with some Yeth hounds, and I used their playbook exactly on that. Killed two NPCs, knocked another unconscious. It was nasty. So and I'm not saying be sadistic, but if you want to absolutely,
that was a really good fight. That was We were that was tense. We were like super. I think that was probably the most worried we've been in a fight. If it wasn't for my heroic turret that I later named, that became a character because he was so heroic, then I think we would have, like, we really feared we were going to go down. So that was a good fight. Yeah.
Wow. So challenging players, making your monsters do cool stuff. Check out these books; they're really good.
Awesome. Yeah, they sound fantastic. A lot of pages though, but unfortunately, it's more of a reference, and you can, based on the monster you're using, pull out what you need. So hey, is everybody...
hell yeah! You wouldn't read this cover to cover, but you certainly can. Oh, I'm using this monster. Let's look up what Keith says. It's kind of the way you use them. Yeah.
So hey, sounds great. Let's get to the main topic.
Mastering the RPG with Connor, Eric, and James. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, James, main topic. We're going to let you run it this week. Take her away.
Yeah. We thought we'd have a bit of a chat about let's face it, it's the master skill of role-playing games. I mean, everyone's got it. It ends up putting points in it. Most people are proficient in it. This is your perception skill, or notice skill if you're using Savage Worlds, or spot hidden skill if you're playing Call of Cthulhu, or investigation skill if you're playing World of Darkness, or you name it, every game's got one, which is I want to notice what's around me. I want to discover the clue. I want to see the guy that's ambushing. I want to spot the secret door. I want to read the invisible writing. I want to see the invisible assailant coming up against me. What do I see? And I guess for perception skills and for role-playing games, this is a critical skill or a critical element of what we do. Because let's face it, everything we do as a dungeon master is describing to our players what they experience in the world. And rather than telling them everything, here's all the secrets, there has to be some mechanic where a player, based on their skill or ability, discovers information in the game world. Teases out a clue, teases out a bit of information, sees something that might be amiss, that we can compare different characters, different non-player characters together. So we thought that we would have a bit of a chat about the big one this week, the perception. And I've reached out to a couple of other Dungeon Masters I play with and some players that have played in my games, some DMs that I've played in their games. We had a bit of a chat about, how does perception work a little bit. But I thought I'd bring some of their comments and questions to the table. But I guess for me, I just wanted to open it up to start with. And one thing I've noticed in a lot of my games is almost everyone puts points in it. Almost everyone chooses proficiency in it. Why do you guys think that players feel the need that you have to be good at perception? Why do you think that players put such high stake onto this skill?
I think because it's the most used skill out of combat. I mean, it's the one that's reliable. You know, sometimes you might take a skill and not know how much it will come up. Like perception's always going to come up. And it's always going to be often critical to either furthering the narrative as far as, looking for clues or something, or, spotting hidden dangers leading up to a combat, or in every mode of play, social, combat, exploration, like it's always kind of usually in the center or near center. So it is kind of, players feel like if I don't take this, I'm just going to miss out on a lot.
Yeah.
Which I think is often not, I think that's often a mistake to do. I mean, personally, I will take perception often, but sometimes I don't. And it's a really fun thing to do and to kind of switch it. It's funny in your game, James, why my character's playing a wannabe private investigator. He's amazing at investigation, but I specifically did not take perception because I thought it fit his character and it would be kind of an interesting play style because he is kind of that absent-minded, professor. So I think that's something to encourage players to do. But yeah, that's why I think I'll switch it over to Carl.
I think I think it hits on the head pretty well. One of the things I look at is it packs a lot of stuff into it. You even mentioned that, James, finding things, recognizing from a social side. There's a lot of stuff packed in there versus maybe some other skills. In the Savage Worlds, there's skills like shooting. We wouldn't do a whole episode on shooting necessarily, right? Because there's so much packed into notice, perception, all those other skills. That's why people put points in, because like Eric, you said, you'll get left out because there'll be a lot of questions asked or a lot of, hey, can you roll for this? And they just won't be participating in the process. So there's a lot there.
It's funny too. In some ways, the experience I'm having with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and I do see it a little bit in Call of Cthulhu as well, is the primacy of perception also changes the entirety of the character. So if you look at something like 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, where perception is linked to their wisdom score, people will very rarely use wisdom as their dump stat because they don't want to have negatives on perceiving things. So instead they'll go to intelligence, and I'm not that intelligent, or I'm not that charismatic, or I'm not that strong. Do you guys find that in Savage Worlds as well, or other systems where people aren't allocating whole swathes of skills because they must take perception, that they must not have a penalty on those?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when you think about different editions, and the more kind of D20 mechanical ones like Savage Worlds, I also play a lot of Pathfinder 2e, have a very different approach. I mean, Savage Worlds, even if you dump smarts, you can invest in notice. It's kind of expensive to do it. Pathfinder 2e went the way of, it's really interesting that perception is completely hard locked to classes. While you can put points into wisdom, actually increasing perception, you can't do it. It's if certain classes get better perception. But I mean, yeah, certainly. I mean, I think with 5e, I think also the problem with wisdom, just put it, is because of wisdom saving throws, right, too? Like those are more brutal than say in charisma or intelligence. But yeah, it definitely does define. I mean, in Savage Worlds, we have smarts kind of being linked to like, arcane backgrounds, even if you're a spirit-based one, like you were experiencing, right? So I think that is an issue for sure. I think that definitely is an issue where people are less likely to dump something just because of perception. And when in a game where perception might be the only skill, versus 5e, which has perception and insight, wisdom, that has investigation with intelligence, it's even worse, to happen. So Savage Worlds, I rarely see people, people usually have at least a D6 and notice. Carl, I don't know if you think the same, but yeah.
Well, especially now that it's one of the cores, you're always going to have some notice. But I think the thing about Savage Worlds, again, that's the game I play most, is there's really not a lot of dump stats because generally they're all used for something. But people will invest minimally to have some notice because even in Savage Worlds, there's the notice. And I think we'll talk a little bit about where notice might be misused or perception misused. There's still a lot of questions on calling for notice rolls, maybe when they're not necessary or whatever. So people feel, again, they need to be there if they can. Otherwise, they can't roll at the time or be part of the conversation about what's found or what people are looking for, that sort of thing.
And of course, we're talking about perception or notice in Savage Worlds, but a lot of these systems have a lot of different but same kind of mechanics around a lot of these skills. So Dungeons & Dragons has perception plus investigation. Call of Cthulhu has spot hidden, but also listen, which is a different kind of perception. There's insight as well, if you want to notice things within a social context. Investigation is a big one in World of Darkness, but also games like Blades in the Dark and other skills. Has this kind of expanded out for a bit more than what it might have used to have been? I mean, I remember old school Dungeons and Dragons where there wasn't a perception per se. There was find, remove traps, which was a percentage chance that only rogues could do. Everything else was like, well, you just fall into it.
And low-level rogues weren't that good at it either, unfortunately. If you were a low-level rogue.
I have a 4% chance of finding a trap. Yeah,
and that was the thing about old school games, right? OSR, it's your talent. This is the player versus character skill. You would say, I noticed something because I told the game master I'm looking under the bed and I'm poking around to see if I found a trap door, and it'd be very, very. You'd have to be specific, or Game Master goes, "Oh, you never looked in a drawer. Too bad for you. You didn't find what you were looking for." So the new games, I think they help a little more. It's good to go the other way a little bit, but not do everything with these checks. So.
Yeah, that's a good point that you brought up. And I mean, we might talk about this more later, but I am definitely in the other side of the camp, the newer side, and I think that GMs get lost on using too many notice rolls, and like you said, looking in a certain drawer. Like, why? If they're searching the room, let them search the room. If they're searching the body, they don't even need to roll. I think we'll talk about this more, but that's a big hang-up for me. So we'll move on. Yeah.
And we'll get to that. Yes, the hiding things behind dice rolls. So one way I thought we might look at this discussion is let's have a look at the two big ways that people really use these rolls in a game. And then I've got a few questions, like I said, that a couple of Dungeon Masters have posed to me. Some of them are a bit specific to 5th edition, but I'm sure that we could make them a little bit more generic. The first big way that I think perception's used within games, and let's talk a little bit about it, is perception and plot. This is where a storyteller, a games master, has written a clue, and it could be a secret door, it could be a lost message, it could be some kind of information that the group will need to obtain before the story can progress. Whether it's a concealed note, a secret compartment in a drawer that has some keys, for example, and an investigation horror game like Call of Cthulhu, this is huge. This is a massive part of this game because half of what you're doing is finding clues and being the detective within the scene. So I guess for the group, how do you guys use perception in these cases? What do you think some of the pitfalls are? Where do you think people go wrong? Eric, I know you've got some pretty strong thoughts about this one.
I think
Let's talk about perception and clues. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can bounce back and forth. I think, like I said, a big hang-up I have is I think GMs can often get kind of caught in where they overuse perception way too much and think that everything has to be behind a perception roll, which is absolutely not the way it should be done.
Nope.
I mean, normally we don't have to searching a body, right? And this is what I go to as using the prime example. It is, unless this person has a extremely well hidden pocket inside a full where it's actually makes sense that they would have to be skillful to find it. But remember, you shouldn't roll if it's something that's just easy to do. Rolls are there to be actual challenges, and I think GMs maybe often get caught up in it. Always has to be a roll to search for something, which is not. It shouldn't be. Yeah, Carl.
Well, so let me pile on a little bit there. Pile on notice. Anyway, let me. The other side of that is. You're right. Easy things.
I think that was a Savage World thing.
Yeah.
Sorry,
well, you pile on perception rolls too, right? Easy things should be easy, right? If you're searching a body, you should be able to search about it. But also, you shouldn't hide important plot elements behind a notice roll because if you fail, suddenly you can't move the plot forward. And there's a lot of times I've seen people where they go, "Hey, give me a perception roll." They roll perception, they fail, and they go, anyway, you found this. It's like, well, then why did you even have them roll? And they shouldn't have rolled anyway if it's important from a plot standpoint. And there's a whole, there's the whole, what's the theory behind like the three clue rule where, if you're going to make it hard to find something, there should be something else they can find that can lead them in the same direction, but never hide plot behind a roll that if you fail, it's going to come to a grinding halt, or you got to just make it, hand wave it away. Then why do it? If there's no consequence for failure, then why roll the die? So I'm totally on the same page. It's like the two sides of the same coin. You shouldn't make things hard if they're easy, and you should just be able to do them. But also, if it's something you need, don't mess with a roll.
So where would you do a dice roll in that instance?
Well, I think
I want to
go ahead,
okay,
Derek.
Go on. Sorry.
Well,
I just wanted to mention one thing first is that often I think when GMs there's always that illusion of not choice, but there is that aspect to it, right? Where I forget what it's called, but where they went left instead of right, so you just move the ogre to the left.
Quantum
So they were
ogre.
always going to
It's
encounter
the quantum
what?
ogre. It's the quantum
Quantum
ogre.
ogre. Thank you. I was trying to remember the term. So it's the quantum ogre. I think you can kind of do the same thing with important information too. Like maybe have that notice roll, but have other ways where they could maybe encounter using other skills, or down the line somebody would just give it to them. So they're always going to get the information, but maybe sometimes you can set it up where they can feel like they actually earned the information, but still have it. Don't just, like you said, Carl, don't just have that be the only way they get it. So you just hand it to them. You can still give multiple options and still have a fallback where they probably will always somehow, through their actions gain it, but they felt like they gained it. So it's still to them. They felt like they gained it.
Yeah,
I just want to throw that as an option.
Yeah, and I think I'll throw another thing in there. What Notice can do, if you want to have a role, is provide additional insight into, there's the basic.
Yeah.
I found this thing that I should be finding to move forward, but yeah, do a Notice. Okay, or do a Perception. And I'll use Notice, Perception, Call of Cthulhu things. I'll use them all interchangeably. Go ahead and roll that, and you notice that piece of paper is actually parchment, which a little bit of extra information makes the person who's more insightful or more perceptive feel like they got something out of it, but it wasn't necessary to move things forward. So I think your idea is a good idea, for sure, that ultimately you have to get that information to them, and maybe it makes them, I failed to notice, and you didn't find anything. It's like, there should have been something here. I got to figure out another way of getting it. I guess that would work. Not my preferred way.
Not always,
obviously.
but
Yeah.
something to sometimes do to have fallback, just to give people that illusion that they, accomplished this major plot point or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. What do you think,
One,
James?
one approach I've seen, I guess, is that sliding scale of success. So when you might assign a difficulty and you'll say, make your perception roll, and they roll a 12 where you get some basic information. 18, you get more. 20, you get more. 25, you get much more. 30, you get everything. But the other one I've seen is when a fail occurs and you don't fail to give the information, but instead there's a complication based on what else might have happened.
Yeah.
So it could take a lot longer. Or you could be clumsy in your approach, so that you find it, but you might destroy it in the process. So yes, you find the note, but you kind of by opening it to the fresh air, it collapses in your hands. You only got a few seconds to glean the most basic information, so that you can kind of get the plot out there, but with some kind of caveat. So it's restricted, or the time frame's a little bit different. And in a similar vein, if people are trying to move very quickly, like I will quickly search the body because we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
Well, then there's the opportunity of failure. Well, no, you don't actually find anything because unless you want to stop and search properly. And I guess that might be another element as well.
I think that's pretty
And
cool.
I think
I like that idea of failing your notice means you failed to notice something that drives a complication. That's cool. I like that. I like that for sure.
And on piling on that, which is a really cool feature, and I've done something like that in Pathfinder, where you can also, if they fail it, you tell them the information, but to give them something false that will actually hurt them in the upcoming battle or whatever. So like they notice something wrong, and that's actually going to be like an actual complication in the battle, and that could apply to other skills too. Yeah. But that is a fun, really mechanic to do. That was good on you.
Just be careful of the red herrings, because players just go off the rail whenever you get a red herring.
Don't.
I've lost 6 sessions of a Call of Cthulhu game on a red herring once. It's like, oh no, we don't go here. Let's go to Scandinavia. Like, oh shit. Like, whoops. Let's talk about piling on for a while here, because this is a bit of a problem for me, and I struggle with this in a lot of ways. In fact, I've had to make a bit of a house rule around it. And that is, one player will go, I will try and search for secret doors. Okay, make a perception check. Oh, no, you failed. No, you don't find any secret doors. The next player goes, well, I'll try and find secret doors. And there's a group of 5 people, and you just sit there and you go through the 5 dice rolls until one of them invariably succeeds. Of course, when the first one succeeds, then no one has to bother again. Or ultimately, if someone rolls very, very high and you hear, no, you don't find anything, then that's it. Everyone just accepts the fact that it's all been found. How do you guys deal with piling on and that inevitable metagaming that occurs around perception?
I think I have a similar house rule to you. I often when I do run games, I often limit skills to like 2 people actively making a skill, and then other people can support if it's Savage Worlds or whatever, or aid in 5e. I think another good thing to do, if somebody says, I want to check for notice, or I want to check perception on if there's a secret door, you would ask then, before they even roll, does anybody else want to? Like, one other person can. So before, you know, in your example of somebody rolled high so the other person doesn't bother, you upfront say, who wants to roll? Then you guys roll. Like, make sure the whole, you know, who on the party wants to do this. The other party can do something else, you know, at the same time too. So I think house ruling it to limit that, say that I don't usually allow more than this set amount of people, and kind of being upfront for who wants to roll is the way I usually run it.
Well, first off, I don't think I would call it necessarily a house rule, because you can, as a game master, and you'll see me, Eric, do this in games too. It's like, okay, who's on the roof of the truck? Well, only you two have a chance of noticing this thing going on. Or, you know, the people who have said, hey, I want to look around, they're the only ones who have a chance to noticing. And of course, Savage Worlds, like you mentioned, has this concept of support. So if somebody really wants to help out, they can, but there's still only going to be the one roll to figure it out. So you can pile on, but I don't think I don't want to call that a house rule. You're just limiting who actually has the opportunity, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, you limit who can attack something based on where they're located, so you should be able to limit based on who said they're actually going to do something ahead of time. I
normally apply one of 2 kind of limitations. Normally it'll be a rule of 2, so 2 people can attempt something in one given moment. But the other one I'll often use, and particularly I do this with kids too, so that they get a sense of what different characters' strengths are, is I'll limit it to people who are proficient in things. So who's proficient in perception? Well, you're good at seeing these things, so I'll get you to roll, and only those proficient will be allowed. And that allows some kids to then, you know, kind of flex their muscles, and it calls in on kids that might be a bit quieter than normal, and then it kind of allows them to play a bit more. But that limitation, I think can be very important. How do you go with metagaming, guys? How do we deal with that? Because that's a huge, this perception is the metagaming skill, isn't it? Yeah. It's understanding things that your character might not ever understand, or as a player you might not know, or as a player you now know based on a dice roll whether things have been found or not. How do you deal with it?
I don't. I'm not that worried about metagaming, because it's a game. And if you really want to limit your enjoyment by trying to use, this is not like I read the module beforehand and I know what's happening. It's more if it's important, okay, that's fine. You know, we let people like make 12 paragraphs worth of conversations in combat, even though they should only be able to say one word all the time. We do that. So I don't get too bent out of shape.
Let it go.
As long as we get rid of as long as it's not the piling on. That's the only metagaming kind of thing that I'm concerned about. I don't know, Eric, what do you think?
I mean, it's an interesting question. Honestly, different systems approach it differently. Savage Worlds has no systems at all for that. I mean, it's just not there. 5e, you know, I think, James, it has passive perception, passive insight, which are optional, but that's what they're there for. They're there to be kind of the non-metagaming thing. Pathfinder 2e just has straight secret rolls for all that stuff. Yep. I mean, the GM rolls behind the screen and that uses your modifier, so there is no chance of that. Metagaming is one of those things, and we could have we're going to have a whole episode about it, because it is a very interesting subject. I mean, there's a lot there, because even the best people, you just sometimes can't help but like, even if you're like I feel about myself as a player that I don't metagame. I try not to metagame, but there's just, with perception especially, like, it's hard not to. I mean, you know, if somebody rolled high on perception and the GM said, oh, you know, they're not, or, you know, you can see this, or if it's insight, right, they're not lying, then you'll, because you saw that high die, you'll think, oh, that's definitely true, when it might not be, or your character might not act that way, right? So I think if we're taking Carl's approach and we're not just doing it, you should definitely incentivize people for playing their characters. If their character would normally, you know, not believe that person or do something different based on a flaw, where Savage Worlds has, I think this is maybe where Savage Worlds deals with this, like playing a hindrance when the person obviously got a good notice roll. we reward them for that. So I think you can apply that to other systems too, is to incentivize people for maybe not always just going along with the knowledge they get from a high perception roll or
interesting.
something.
Don't meta game, and then you'll get meta currency, right? So in Savage Worlds, it's a penny.
Yeah.
There can be in D&D you've got
inspiration,
and some. It's like don't meta game, and I'll give you a meta game tool. I like that. That's.
I mean, there's people will, and it's not because people are trying to metagame.
No.
It's not because people are not trying to be their character. I think we often, we play these games for hours on ends. We play them for weeks and months and years. So we often get, just kind of caught in the rhythm of things, right? It's another notice roll. We've done these a million times. So having a way to like kind of forcibly makes you or encourages you greatly to kind of mix it up or not maybe jump off of somebody else's role I think it's a good thing. I think we should incentivize players for doing that.
I mean, we're
James,
humans.
What is your main ways that you do it?
I've fallen in love with passives. There's no question. In the past, I used to do secret roles with someone's skill, and you do the maniacal. I'm a dungeon master. Listen to me clack. What's he rolling now? It's kind of freaking people out. Which I'll now do as stealth rolls to compare against someone's passive. In the past, I also used to pre-roll perception rolls for each character. Oh, so I might roll 10 times and just have them in front of me, and then roll a D10 just to give myself a kind of randomness about it, just to say, and then I'd cross them off so that there's a opportunity for success and failure as you go through it. I'm leaning more and more and more into passive roles now. I'm finding them much easier to use, and it's rewarding, and I find it's quicker in the game. It avoids some pitfalls that you'll often get, and in fact, this is one of the comments that one of the dungeon masters gave to me, which was this question. I might ask the question and then answer it. How do you avoid the I move 10 foot down a passageway and go, I check for traps, I check for traps, I check for traps? Or even worse, the one time you don't say, I check for traps, and then the DM goes, you didn't say it, God. Now you've fallen in the pit. And for me, passives is the way you do that. If you've got a strong passive perceiving character, and for those that don't know, in 5th edition, you take your perception ability, add 10 to it, and that's your passive. So anything below that, you can kind of see, you can guess automatically. Anything above it, well, you might have to actively be searching for it, which means the dice roll. So a good example is I've got a very perceptive rogue in one of my games, has maximized investigation, maximized perception, and if they walk past a secret door, I just say, you feel a breeze from under your ankles. There's something behind that wall. You can feel it. You can feel the change in air pressure. And as you gaze, you can actually see the vague outline. I'll just say it because it saves that issue of having to move forward. In a similar vein, the great example of this is, say, you get attacked while half the group's asleep, because I do this all the time. We sneak up on people and ambush them in the dark. A lot of games masters will say, all right, let's roll perception to see if you wake up. And often it can be deadly. Suddenly 3 or 4 people fail that roll, and the one guy that was awake on guard duty just gets cut down, even though that they're fighting and screaming and yelling. In this instance, passive perception, the people who with high perception just wake up and get to do stuff. It just kind of allows for speed of game. So that's how I run it. I've fallen in love with the passives, and I'm now even using it for games that don't have it. I'm kind of running it in Call of Cthulhu now that doesn't have rules for it. I'm just saying, if you've got a spot hidden of over 70%, you'll be aware of this, as opposed to having to roll and forcing people to roll stuff that they should succeed anyway if they've put that many points in that and are that skilled in it.
Can I throw in a different take on it too? Which I do like passives a lot. I think if it's not in a game that you have, or you may not like that, and this is something that Pathfinder 2e does very well. It has these kind of there's different modes. One's an encounter mode, but one's exploration mode. And one thing you can do is you can just say, I'm searching. That's what I'm doing for exploration. And I actually now use this when I do Savage Worlds, I will use this too. And I did this in D&D, where I just kind of take it. Like, what do you do? Like, we're exploring, say, a dungeon, or we're exploring overland travel. What is your role? What is your role? What is your role? So somebody just says, I'm searching. I might just have them make one roll, and that's the roll for everything. And if there's a hidden creature, if there's, if they say I'm searching maybe for like hidden stuff, I just have them do one roll. I'm not going to have them search every single time. Also, I've done stuff where it's like, if they say they're searching, if they're about to trigger a trap, I'm like, okay, roll notice right now. Just roll notice. And in Savage Worlds, I'd be like, roll notice a trap's about to go off because they can use bennies, right? So I think it's important. Savage Worlds encourages spending meta currency for that. But other games, just having that notice roll be something that triggers when they would encounter it, because that's what they said they were doing. You guys talked before about the old school way of like, well, you didn't search a drawer, so you didn't find that. Like, no, I think that's just horrible, because that's just going to slow, like you said, it slows everything down. I think it can be expected if we're, these people are professional adventurers, right? That's what they are. They're professional at what they're doing. Like, if they're saying I'm searching this area, that's what I want to do, they're going to search everywhere. They're going to look. And then, so the role there is the one role is there to actually determine how good they do. So, instead of passive,
one of the strange anomalies of old school Dungeons and Dragons used to be, okay, so what do you do? Well, I look at the wall and I push, prod, twist, turn, lift, smell. You list every little possible function that you kind of do with every little object.
And if it's a Tomb of Horrors, you die anyway. If it's a Tomb of Horrors, you're going to die anyway. Right. No matter how much you poke, prod, whatever, you're going to die anyway. So, Eric, I think I believe in the same thing, but part of it's dungeon design too, right? I mean, if there's a chance of a trap every 5 feet, people are going to check every 5 feet. But if you just kind of bucket it, you're going down the hall, you get to the door, you roll and notice, oh, halfway down, you notice this thing, right? So I think you're spot on, and I do agree. Pathfinder 2e does a good job of codifying that and saying, here's how things just should be done in exploration mode.
Both work.
Whatever.
And the other element, I guess, too, is providing some descriptive information that would allow just players to get a sense of what's going on here, and then allow roll to shortcut the problem in a lot of ways. So you see two statues with ruby red eyes on either side of the hallway. Across the floor you see some ornate glyphs. At the far end of the wall you see an open moored mouth and a faint smell of something that smells a little bit like ozone. Well, you've given the players a clue to understand there's a trap here. There's some things you can interact with. There's some choices you can make, but then making that perception or investigation roll might discount or add a bit of clue as to what might be going on here a little bit more than you might ordinarily have. I guess that's the other way to use traps in some ways.
Yep. Makes sense.
Moving on to, I guess, the second part, and we can talk for hours, as it looks like we can. The other part of perception, I guess, is as a foil to stealth or sneaking or hiding. This is the hide and seek element to perception rolls within role-playing games. So in often cases, when you're trying to spring an ambush, where you're trying to sneak up on some monsters, it'll be the monsters that have to roll perception to see if they're being ambushed. But more often than not, it's the players. It's the players that are sleeping in the hotel room that are about to be ambushed by hidden frogmen assailants in Call of Cthulhu, or it could be a carefully placed goblin ambush on a trail that you're about to walk into. And it's about how do you deal with this in terms of who wins, who loses, who notices, who doesn't. And in some ways this goes into surprise, which has a whole other different side of mechanic. But are there any hard and fast rules, any ways that you guys deal with ambushes and perception? And what are some of the pitfalls that you've fallen into, if you pardon the pun?
You want me to start? Okay. Well, I think one of the interesting things is the system I love, Savage Worlds, and I play it a lot, helps a little bit with that, because you can tell the players that there's a band of goblins behind a tree. Let's see if you notice some, and then you can play your bennies if you want to, or you just go ahead and get surprised. You can do that. Or if you're not, then... And Savage Worlds has opposed rolls too. So you're really their stealth versus your notice. It's really codified into the ability to kind of find what's going on with respect to somebody sneaking around. I'm not sure how modern Dungeons and Dragons does it, versus kind of the older school. It'd be much more, is the player keeping their eyes out for what's going on, and are they being very careful and looking around? So I don't know, Eric, do you have a different perception on that?
No, I mean, like you said, I think every system has its. I mean, every different system has its system in place for that. James, I think you probably have a twist on it for 5e. I mean, 5e, I think, the passive perceptions are really mostly used for monsters as a check. And for 2e, that's exactly what it's used. I mean, every skill has a DC version of it, which is 10 plus your skill. So when people are rolling perception to find a hidden creature, you can either use the DC of their stealth, or they can actively roll stealth too and compare it to the player's DC for their perception. So I often do think it's good where Savage Rolls uses opposed rolls. I think it's quicker to use, where one thing's rolling, one thing's using a DC. I think it's better always if players are rolling. I think it's more fun. And I think it saves time if the GMs are using their DC anyways. But I think a good rule to fall on is always having players roll, GMs use DC. As far as ambushes, I mean, they all have their own rules. I think ambushes. I don't know. What is your take on ambushes in D&D? Because I think that's the hot topic here, James. Where there's a lot of controversy over way it's used. Is it too powerful? Because 2e, Pathfinder 2e, they just took that out. There's really nothing. I think the only thing that happens is you can have a negative to your initiative, and that's it. There's no free rounds of combat, nothing like that.
Fifth edition is problematic in some ways because the mechanic says use a passive. Okay, so every monster will have their passive perception score listed, and then the players will roll stealth to see if they're able to be unseen and unheard before they trigger this ambush. So if we're looking at a player-led ambush issue, that's a whole other thing. And the reason why it's complicated is because there's a lot of abilities that will give you bonuses on being able to be stealthy.
Pass without trace?
Pass without trace is the perfect one.
That is the
Give plus 10 to your stealth rolls. Now, a lot of monsters have a passive perception of below 10. And so there is zero way that these monsters can actually see you or hear you if you're casting Pass Without Trace. And should you even need a dice roll if the DC is less than what you'll automatically get? And so in a lot of ways, this then becomes, you get an absurdity where players can never be perceived by their enemies and foes. And in often ways, it frustrates the hell out of me because you'll end up with a 40-minute discussion between players about how to effectively execute the perfect ambush that, of course, fails after the very first dice roll.
Yeah.
The other... And of course, there's other ways of looking at this, and I think we can talk about this about stealth in another episode. But the idea being the guy in plate mail armor will always make noise and just ruin that concept. In terms of ambushing players, I mean, I love an ambush. I love a surprise attack. I love the invisible creature assassin coming out of nowhere and stabbing people in the middle of the feast, and the king is killed, and because it's great plot and it's great drama and it's got good visual, having a surprise foe appear out of nowhere makes for really exciting storytelling. My issue is if you've got that passive perception of 16, 17, 18, there's no way that they're ever going to get surprised. And so I think it's a little bit fraught. And honestly, I don't know the answer apart from the one player that's got high perception suddenly knows what they're doing.
I think one thing you can do. Oh, sorry. Okay.
I was just going to say, what about subterfuge in the sense of the way these ambushes are put together and the perception? They see something that's not quite right. Like they see that there's some bushes or whatever on the trail, not in the right spot. And then that clues them in. But that could be somebody setting that, making it obvious. And then, I mean, do they get passive no matter what, even if somebody's smart and they've set it up and said, oh, this is the honey pot. You'll fall into this one. And then that lets me take you on. It just feels like it doesn't matter, right? I mean, once your attention's on something, it should be not on something else. But I don't know, Eric.
That's pretty much exactly what I was going to say. No, that's exactly what I was going to say. And then to that point, James, I think this comes into what I was going to say. Know your players and play to their strengths and play to their weaknesses. If you know you have a player who has this high perception, this massive passive perception, if we're talking about 5e, then when you're setting an ambush, if it's somebody who's ambushing the players, they're normally going to be a smart, tactical experience group, right? So they might have known this person is really good. You know, they're just really reactive. They're really good at spotting things. So have maybe you know, for this ambush to make it interesting, have somebody go in and distract them. Like have something else happen to distract them. Then maybe make them roll or something. Don't just rely on their passive perception, or mess with them in some way so there is some tension there, so you can still have those moments. Because you should always have the ability to surprise people. Because like you said, James, that's a really interesting mechanic. It's high drama. It's really good for the narrative. You know, you want to mix things up. You don't always have the same fights happen the same way every time. So I think this goes into knowing your players a lot and tailoring things specifically to take advantage of players' abilities or weaknesses. And also, you know, you always want to bring stuff in to let players feel like they're heroes, no matter what. And this will go into something else that I think we'll talk about it later. But is that what you do often, James? Will you have somebody mess with the player to kind of allow that ambush to happen?
Yeah, sometimes after the initial start of a fight, I will have other creatures still lying in wait, so that you can stagger the ambush in some way. So that so that the initial combat has happened, we have hidden assailants waiting as either reinforcement or as a second wave of attack. And then as players maneuver around the battlefield, I'll trigger a perception check then, or trigger their passive so they can see that those bushes are moving, and you hear the sound of move. There are more forces coming your way from there, but I'll generally allow a round's notice to let people know that that's coming in some ways, unless they just happen to just accidentally stumble in on it. And in some ways, again, it's for dramatic reasons. In a lot of ways, I throw the rule book out the window at that point and just go, it makes for better story.
It feels like something you definitely want to talk about, right? Like Eric, you said, know your players. I'm not necessarily saying it's a session 0 type thing, but understanding that, you know, somebody's got a high perception, that they understand that they're not always going to magically see everything. If that's because it is dramatically interesting, like if I use this subterfuge or this, you know, misdirection, it may happen. And I don't want people to be like, pissed off, honestly, because I've got such a high perception. I should see these guys, you know, I should basically have x-ray vision for the forest and see these guys coming through. So not necessarily session 0, but it should be kind of understood. And you know, if you talk to your players about it, I guess that would be an important for those folks who have that high level of perception or what have you.
And I guess it goes back to that level of consistency at all times, doesn't it? So because I temper these ambushes with the idea that someone with high perception spots the secret door, so that they get some wins, that they then get some challenges. You know, that you don't just have them. It's not random in terms of whether they succeed or whether they fail or not. One last thing, I guess, before we wind up this topic is one last little question that I was actually sent by a dungeon master, a bear, which is about invisibility, because invisibility is a big. Everyone loves it. People want to use it. It's a very low-level spell in Dungeons & Dragons, only a second-level spell, so you can use it all the time. Invisible assailants and how you actually deal with it, because it's very complicated, I find. 5th edition doesn't do it very well, in that it just gives you disadvantage on a roll. So most people think invisible means I can't be seen. But in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, your footprints can still be seen. You can sense the movement. It's almost kind of like you see the shimmering of almost Predator style, but that's not how most people think of it. Invisible's a whole other ball game when it comes to perception. Yeah. Any tips, any hints? I mean, I'm using virtual tabletops, for example, so I'll just hide the token, but then what do? You have players guess where the creature might be. What do you guys do? How do you guys deal with invisibility in your games?
Poorly.
Well, I mean, every system has its own rules about this. So 5e has very lackluster. Savage Worlds invisibility is usually there's a negative on notice rolls to notice them. Once they are noticed or once combat begins, they usually get a first round. It's just a -4 to hit them. So it's kind of similar to 5e in that way, where, you know, once they've been noticed, it's like you kind of know where they are, but it's still hard to see them. But there's an initial part of it where they're hard to see. Pathfinder 2e is like a whole other ball game where there's different states of perception in that game. So there's like concealed, detected, undetected, unknown. There's all these different states.
Sounds complicated.
You can do seek which can either be a burst or a cone. And some people, they know, yeah, so it's this whole other thing. They take it the other direction from 5e, which is a little on the fence about. I like to kind of go in between all of those. I mean, with a virtual tabletop, yeah, you can make them invisible. I think have them at first. Invisibility, like how Savage Worlds does it, should be something that's extremely hard to see. Once battle begins, though, and if somebody has successfully detected them, you can then make it known that you kind of know where this person is, but then, and everybody else kind of knows where they are, but they have that minus to hit them or whatever, or they have disadvantage. But initially they don't. It's like initially it's extremely hard to hit them, and then if that character, that NPC chooses to then go hide, start that process over again. Like if they then spend their turn to then go, kind of go somewhere else and hide, make their token invisible and make it kind of suspenseful again for the players to even know where they are and have them do another notice check. So I think it's kind of dynamic in that way. And like I said, depending on the system, but I generally kind of play that way across the board. I don't know. When you do invisibility with Savage Worlds, what do you do, Carl?
Well, again, Savage Worlds, like I think you hit on all the points.
Yeah.
I mean, it codifies. It's hard to do things, but it's not. It's more like the Predator that James brought up. It's once I kind of know where you are, I can see the shimmer. I get a feel for it, but I'm still not sure I'm swinging at your arm or I'm swinging at your body because you're basically invisible. And so that's where the negative comes into. Invisibility's, I don't think I do very well on it, but honestly, it's, I feel like it's kind of based on the situation at hand where, if they did a really good job with their invisibility and they thought about it and, they're hiding their tracks and everything. Yeah. Give them a little extra boost there. But once combat starts, people are kicking dirt at you and, so it's just that negative. And so it makes sense with the disadvantage in D&D.
But gone are the days where every adventurer needs a bag of flour or a handful of ball bearings to find the invisible person.
But you should
That's a whole nother episode.
Do something like that. I mean,
OSR.
I mean, Savage Worlds has that built in with tests, but I think that's something like if you are being dynamic with it and you have the, even though they're now detected, they choose to go off and hide again. Like if a player says, "Oh, I spend my action doing this," then make it so then that person can't hide anymore, right? I think we want to reward creative and dynamic play. I don't know.
Yes.
Does that ever happen with you, James, or in your games?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know me. I like invisible guys that just go away and hide under a table and come back. I'm back again. It's got to be the endless ambush. I'm a big sucker for it. Endlessly ambushing players. It's a great way to spend a Sunday afternoon.
So
okay.
Oh, I was. Can we just touch on a couple more things? I think one thing I wanted to bring up real quick was that one of the pitfalls I think is people overuse notice checks for a lot of things. Something in D&D I've seen, not laziness, but people just be like, "We'll just do a notice." When you're like, "Well, that's really investigation, right?" I think that's a pitfall that can often happen. In Savage Worlds, there's different edges that apply to different things. So some of them maybe just apply to, just applies to noticing things like in the environment, where it wouldn't apply to looking for clues. So I think we definitely make sure you're rewarding across the spectrum. Another thing is, I think we should reward players for dynamically using other skills and maybe bring that up to players. So while something might normally be a notice check, if you know a player is really good in science, maybe offer them to use science if it's applicable instead of notice, where it could make sense. Where even though it might be something like, you're trying to notice footprints, because they might have science, they could tell that, it looks disturbed there. Rocks are usually this way. This type of rock is this way. So maybe let them use science with maybe a negative or something. So I think we can encourage players to not just rely on notice so much or perception by rewarding them to use, letting them use their skills that they're good at, maybe with negatives or something. So I think it's something to think about. I don't know. Do you guys ever do that at all, or?
I like the idea of unbundling it, but I'm not sure I do it too much, but maybe I will now.
Yes, it's very much part of the Call of Cthulhu, even the World of Darkness, is that the skill that you have not only is how you can do things, but if you notice things related to that skill as well. So a mechanical repair, for example, not only allows you to repair something, it also notices if something's been sabotaged. So, yeah, there's certainly scope for most games to be able to do that. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Excellent. Well, I think we did a pretty good job of covering that topic with a lot of good input. I thank everyone for tuning in. I hope everyone got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherpg.com, and if you've got questions, and we saw that we had some game masters, DMs asking some questions that we helped answer with respect to perception. If you got, even need to adjudicate something where you're arguing, hey, that's fine too. Just drop us a note at GameMaster@masteringtherpg.com. Both of those are one word. And if you like the show, hopefully soon enough we'll be on all the podcatchers. It seems to be harder than I thought. So if you're listening to this, you listened by getting to the link. And we appreciate everybody listening, and hope you'll continue to listen. Once again, this is Carl, Eric, and James saying thank you so much for being here with us. Have a great night.
Happy gaming.